Racist, cop punches elderly, black man on sidewalk, then realizes he's the mayor. Have you ever wondered if a single punch could change everything? A punch, something that might seem like a sudden impulsive action, could open the door to a journey you never saw coming. A punch could hit not just one person, but the very foundation of an entire community. Imagine this: you're walking down the street on a calm morning when suddenly a simple yet intense action unfolds. An elderly man unknowingly becoming a victim. And the person behind this act, someone you'd never expect. Before we dive into the story, I have a question for you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Leave a comment. We'd love to know where you are and what you think about the story that's about to unfold. Today's story isn't just going to surprise you, it's going to make you reflect on the things we often overlook in life. A lost truth, a denied justice, and a punch that hits not just the body but the heart of an entire city. So join me as we start this journey together and discover what happens next after that punch. This story will change the way you see the world around you. It was a quiet morning in a small town in the Midwest. The sun gently poured over the sidewalk, casting long shadows from the trees onto the pavement. There was nothing remarkable about this moment except for one man standing there quietly. John Harris, 65 years old, holding a bottle of water, gazing off into the distance. He stood alone on the sidewalk, not bothering anyone, not drawing attention to himself. Just another figure in the daily hustle, unnoticed by those rushing by. But for Tyler Grant, a young police officer, 28 years old, he saw something else. Tired from long shifts, weary from the pressures of his job, and perhaps even more so influenced by deep-rooted societal prejudices, Tyler felt a sense of entitlement. He was a cop. He had the power. He approached John with impatience and frustration. "Why are you standing here?" Tyler snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet. Everything seemed to freeze for a moment. John didn't immediately respond. He took a half step back, looking at Tyler calmly, almost as if trying to avoid confrontation. But that only made Tyler angrier. Without a word, Tyler yanked the bottle from John's hand and tossed it to the ground, the cap flying off as water splashed across the pavement. "You think you can just hang out here?" Tyler shouted. And then without warning, he swung his fist, landing a punch squarely on John's face. The punch hit like lightning. John crumpled to the ground instantly, no time to react. His head slammed onto the pavement, blood starting to pool from his mouth. The crowd stood frozen. Some eyes widened in shock, others in fear, but no one moved to stop it. A woman pulled her child closer. A college student shakily pulled out his phone, and another person could only stare in stunned silence. Tyler didn't flinch. He turned and walked away, muttering under his breath, "All these old black men are the same." His footsteps echoed coldly as he walked off, indifferent to what had just happened. That punch wasn't just a physical blow. It was an attack on John Harris's dignity, on his years of quiet service to the community. Tyler Grant in that moment wasn't just a cop doing his job. He became a symbol of a society where power can be abused without consequence. The people who witnessed it stood still, as if frozen, unable to act, only able to remember. And for John Harris, that punch wasn't just an injury to his body, it was an injury to everything he had stood for. Yet the silence in the crowd, the tense stillness in the air, hinted at something else. Something was changing. In the bustling rhythm of the city, where lives intersect and then quickly drift apart, it's easy to forget the ones who quietly shape the community. But sometimes just a few words can pull a forgotten story out of the shadows. I remember talking to an old friend of John Harris, one who had known him for years. The friend spoke of him with a reverence that few in the city would recognize today. "John was one of the first to step up when things weren't right," the friend said, leaning in as if to share a secret. "In the 60s, when the civil rights movement was gaining ground, John was there. He wasn't marching with a megaphone or standing on a podium. No, he was much quieter than that. He was organizing behind the scenes, helping, supporting, giving a hand to those who had none." John Harris, the man who had stood alone on that sidewalk, was more than just an old man with a bottle of water. He had been a pillar of the community for decades. In the turbulent 60s, when protests were sweeping across the nation and the fight for civil rights was at its peak, John had been a quiet warrior. He wasn't out in front of cameras or drawing attention to himself. Instead, he worked with those who needed him most: the forgotten, the marginalized, the homeless. He was one of the first to help establish a homeless shelter in this very city, a shelter that became a lifeline for hundreds of people over the years. It wasn't a flashy cause. It didn't earn him headlines or applause, but it earned him something far more valuable, the respect and trust of the people in his community. As I listened, I realized that John Harris had lived a life of service, an unsung hero in every sense. People in the city knew him, but only as a background figure, a silent force. His name was rarely mentioned in the headlines, but his impact was undeniable. He had built relationships over the years, quietly helping others without expecting anything in return. In a world that often celebrated the loudest voices, John had been the one holding up the quiet work, the one who took the time to listen to care and to make real change, even if no one noticed. But as the years passed, John's contributions faded into the background, overshadowed by the faster-paced, louder voices of those who sought recognition. The city had grown, and with it the complexities of urban life, crime politics, and the constant buzz of technology that connected everyone, but also kept them apart. As John aged, many people no longer remembered his work, his sacrifices, or the quiet strength that had helped so many. His shelter, which once offered warmth and food to those in need, now struggled to survive, and it wasn't long before it became just another forgotten building in the city's landscape. But it wasn't just the city that had forgotten. The world around John had moved on, and with it, so had the recognition for his decades of service. The same people who had once trusted him and relied on him now passed him by without a second thought. And in his later years, John simply faded into the background, a man whose legend had never been fully told, never been fully appreciated. What struck me the most, though, was how the community, in all its hustle and bustle, had failed to see the value in such quiet contributions. It was easier to focus on the flashy, the big gestures, the noise. But people like John, those who work behind the scenes, weren't celebrated. They didn't make the headlines and they didn't earn the praises, but their influence was the quiet thread that held everything together. As the world got louder and faster, the quiet heroes like John were drowned out. They became invisible, not because their actions were any less important, but because society was no longer interested in the stories of the unsung. John Harris had given everything to build a foundation of trust and respect in his community, and yet as time passed, it seemed that all of it had been forgotten. But here's the twist. The same society that had forgotten him was now forced to reckon with the consequences of its own neglect. If you think about it, how often do we ignore the quiet ones, the ones who don't demand attention but are always there doing the work, holding things up when no one is looking? John Harris is a reminder that the value of a person isn't measured by the spotlight they occupy, but by the impact they leave behind. He may have been invisible to most, but his legacy was undeniable. Now, as the city continues to move forward, the question remains, will John Harris be remembered only in whispers, or will his story finally come to light just as it deserves? The answer, it seems, is now up to us. Through this reflection, we begin to see the larger picture, the vital role that those often overlooked play in creating real change. John Harris, in his quiet, humble way, had been the very fabric of a community. And now, in the aftermath of the violence that had been inflicted upon him, it was time for his true impact to be realized. As his story slowly starts to unfold in the streets, the question lingers. Will we continue to forget, or will we learn to see the value in the quiet heroes among us? Chapter. At just 28 years old, Tyler Grant had already donned the uniform of a police officer for 3 years. Ambitious, driven, but young and inexperienced, he had a lot to prove. To the outside world, Tyler seemed like every other young cop eager to make a name for himself in a world where power and control could shape a career. But deep down, his vision of the world was clouded by a lack of understanding and maturity. Growing up, Tyler had always been surrounded by a world where authority was everything. His father, a retired police officer, was the ultimate figure of strength and control in their household. Tyler admired his father, but what he didn't realize was how deeply his father's views on power had seeped into his own belief system. His father's words echoed in his head every time a difficult situation arose. Power solves everything, son. When you've got it, people listen. And when you've got it, you don't ask questions, you just act. As a young boy, Tyler didn't question these lessons. He idolized his father, the way he carried himself with authority, the way people obeyed him without hesitation. To Tyler, authority and strength were one and the same, and that belief stayed with him throughout his adult life. When Tyler joined the police force, he was determined to prove that he could live up to the example his father had set. He was eager to make a difference, to be the kind of officer who could take charge in any situation. But instead of learning the subtle balance between authority and empathy, Tyler allowed his father's beliefs to shape his actions, blinding him to the nuances of the work he was supposed to be doing. At first, things went smoothly. He followed orders, enforced the law, and quickly earned the respect of his colleagues. But something inside of him simmered, a belief that quickly grew darker. Tyler began to view certain people differently. People from minority communities, the ones he'd been taught to see as difficult or troublesome. His father had often spoken about those who don't know their place, and those words had stayed with him, growing like a poison in his mind. When Tyler was assigned to patrol the streets, it became clear that he viewed his role not just as an enforcer of the law, but as someone who could dictate the actions of others. He started seeing people not as individuals, but as categories. Black men, poor women, homeless people were all lumped together in a box of those who needed to be controlled. Tyler had not yet learned the true essence of justice, that it's not just about enforcing rules, but understanding the complexities of human behavior, emotions, and the struggles people face every day. Tyler's past shaped him, but it wasn't just the lessons from his father. It was the environment he had grown up in, a neighborhood that had its own share of violence and hardship, where there was always talk of those people on the other side of the tracks. His father, a man hardened by years of service, had spoken of the U.S. versus them mentality, where authority stood firmly against those who dared challenge it. And in Tyler's eyes, that meant anyone who wasn't like him was a threat. The lack of empathy for others, particularly people from marginalized communities, grew over time. He had yet to learn the true weight of the badge he wore. In Tyler's world, power wasn't something to be questioned, it was something to be wielded. He had adopted his father's worldview, not realizing the deep harm it was causing. His lack of emotional maturity and awareness made him susceptible to the very prejudices that society had ingrained in him. Chapter. This wasn't the first time Tyler had crossed the line, but it would be the moment that everything unraveled. When he encountered John Harris that fateful day, his personal biases took control. He saw John as just another old man, another person in his way, someone who didn't belong in the public space. The idea that John was someone who had served his community, who had fought for the rights of others, wasn't in Tyler's frame of reference. All he saw was an obstacle, someone who didn't fit his vision of how the world should work. It's important to note that Tyler didn't just act out of frustration or anger. He acted because he believed he had the right to. He had been taught that his power as a police officer gave him the authority to act without hesitation, to impose control when needed. His actions were a direct result of his warped perception of authority and his inability to see beyond the surface. Back to Sharon. Now let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Tyler wasn't an anomaly. There are many like him police officers who are well-intentioned but lack the emotional intelligence and maturity to understand the human side of their job. Tyler's story isn't unique, but it is a reflection of the deeper systemic issues that plague law enforcement today. When we compare Tyler to historical figures like Norman Oliver, a police officer known for his compassion and sense of justice, the differences become striking. Norman Oliver in films and in real life was a cop who believed in protecting and serving not just with strength, but with empathy. He understood the complexity of human emotions, the struggles of the people he was sworn to protect. He believed in making the community better, not just maintaining control. What Tyler lacked and what Norman had was an understanding of the importance of humanity in policing. Norman knew that the badge didn't just symbolize power, but a responsibility to uplift, to educate, and to serve. Tyler, however, saw the badge as a tool for domination, a way to make others conform to his view of the world. The tragic irony is that Tyler, in his pursuit of power, had forgotten the very essence of what it meant to be an officer. He wasn't there to assert dominance. He was there to uphold justice. But Tyler was too entrenched in his own biases, too blind to the broader picture to see it. He had bought into the idea that power could solve everything, that control could fix all problems. And in doing so, he lost sight of the truth that real justice is never about power. It's about understanding, compassion, and fairness. In the end, Tyler Grant wasn't just a young cop making a mistake. He was a product of a broken system, one that had failed to teach him the values of justice and empathy. His story, while tragic, is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that policing isn't just about law enforcement. It's about understanding the people you serve and protecting their rights, not just their obedience. And for Tyler, the consequences of his actions were about to catch up with him in ways he could never have imagined.
Mr.
It's one of those moments in life where everything seems to stop, but the world around you continues to move. The kind of moment that should demand action, but instead there is only stillness. As Tyler Grant stood over John Harris, his fist raised in anger, the crowd around them froze. It wasn't just the shock of what was happening, it was the disbelief. The kind of disbelief that makes you question if you're seeing what you think you are. But no one moved. No one said a word. People simply stared their eyes wide, some in fear, others in uncertainty, but none in action. There was a college student standing just a few feet away, phone raised high, recording the event. His fingers hovered over the screen, capturing every moment, but even he didn't intervene. The video would go viral later, but in that moment, he too was a part of the silence. He didn't yell for help, didn't run to stop it. Instead, he stood there filming just like everyone else, caught between the desire to help and the fear of what might happen if they did. Why did no one step forward? Why did people stand there paralyzed as an elderly man was assaulted right before their eyes? It's easy to say that the crowd was simply afraid. Fear is a powerful force. It can paralyze you, stop you from moving, from acting, from doing what you know is right. But there's more to it than that. The real question is, why do so many people choose to stay silent in these moments? Why do they allow injustice to unfold right in front of them without lifting a finger? This is not a new phenomenon. History is filled with moments like this, times when people stood by, did nothing, and watched as things went terribly wrong. It's called the bystander effect. In these situations, the more people there are around, the less likely anyone is to step in. Why? Because when there are more people, the responsibility seems to be diluted. Someone else will help, people think. It's not my job to intervene. It's a form of social diffusion. The feeling that if no one else is doing anything, then surely you don't need to either. It's a psychological trap that holds people back from acting. In a world full of distractions, it's all too easy to fall into the trap of apathy. People have become conditioned to believe that they can't change anything, that their actions won't make a difference. But the truth is, every person in that crowd could have made a difference. If one person had stepped forward, if one person had shouted for help or stood between Tyler and John, things might have been different. The silence in that moment wasn't just a result of fear. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue, the lack of willingness to act, to take responsibility, to stand up for what's right. We've seen this before. Rodney King in 1991 was brutally beaten by police officers, and the entire incident was caught on camera. Yet the people who witnessed it didn't stop it. They watched, some even encouraged it. The world saw the violence, but the bystanders in that moment failed to intervene. Warren, because it was easier to stay silent, to pretend nothing was happening, to ignore the injustice unfolding before their eyes. This moment with John Harris and Tyler Grant is no different. The crowd stood still, unsure, hesitant. They were afraid to act, afraid of what might happen if they did. But by choosing silence, they allowed the situation to escalate. By not speaking up, by not intervening, they made themselves complicit in the violence. What would have happened if one person had acted? If someone had shouted stop or rushed to John's side, would that have stopped the attack? We'll never know. But what we do know is this: every moment we choose to remain silent, every moment we allow injustice to unfold in front of us without speaking out, we contribute to the problem. Silence in the face of wrong is an endorsement of it. The lesson here is simple, though not always easy to follow. Action matters. It's not enough to stand by and watch. It's not enough to record what's happening, to be a passive observer. In these moments, we all have a responsibility to do something. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It could be as simple as calling for help, stepping in between, or even just raising your voice. One voice, one action can spark a change. It can make a difference. As the crowd stood silent, the moment passed without anyone stepping forward. The assault on John Harris continued unnoticed by those who could have stopped it. And when the police arrived later, there was no one who could say they had done anything to prevent it. The video would spread. People would comment, would shout out about what happened, but the silence in that moment couldn't be undone. The question is, when the next moment of injustice happens, will you remain silent? Will you be one of the bystanders watching from the sidelines, or will you step up? The real power lies in the hands of the witnesses. In the choices we make, in the actions we take. Every time we choose to stand by, we become part of the problem. And every time we choose to act, we take a step toward fixing it. The question is no longer about the crowd that stood still. It's about you. Will you stand silent, or will you stand up? The silence of the crowd may have lasted only a moment, but its impact would last much longer. John Harris paid the price for the apathy of those around him, but it was a price that we all share. And in the end, it's up to each of us to decide whether we will continue to stand by or if we'll finally find the courage to act. The morning after the incident, Tyler Grant could still feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the rush of authority he had felt when his fist collided with John Harris's face. It had been a quick, almost instinctive act. There was no hesitation in his movement, no second thoughts, just a sharp burst of aggression born out of frustration. He hadn't given a second thought to the man he was confronting. He hadn't cared who he was or what kind of life he had lived. But that would all change in a matter of moments. It wasn't until later that day when the news started circulating that Tyler was hit with the full weight of his actions. People began talking about it first in whispers, then in louder voices. The name that everyone kept mentioning made Tyler's stomach drop. He heard it from a fellow officer. "Did you hear that guy? He wasn't just some old man on the street. That was John Harris. You know, the one who's been honored for his work in the community? He's been a leader, man. He helped shape this city." Tyler blinked, confused. John Harris? The name didn't mean anything to him at first, but as the pieces began to fall into place, his pulse quickened. John Harris wasn't just another elderly man on a street corner. He wasn't just a random, faceless figure. John Harris was a man who had been deeply respected, a man whose work had been celebrated by the very people Tyler swore to protect. He felt the room spin for a moment as the realization hit him. John Harris wasn't just some nobody. He was a hero, a man who had dedicated his life to helping others, to fighting for justice, to standing up for what was right. John had received numerous awards over the years, including honors from the very government Tyler had pledged to uphold. He had even been honored by the president for his lifetime of service to the community, for his tireless work in helping the homeless, for leading the charge during the civil rights struggles of the past. He was a man of integrity, someone who had built trust with people, not through power, but through compassion. Tyler felt the shock seep into his bones. How had he not known? How had he not seen that this man was someone who had shaped lives, changed the very fabric of the city he swore to serve? In his anger and his rush to assert control, he had struck a man who was revered, a man whose entire life had been about making the world a better place. The impact of this realization was immediate. For the first time since the incident, Tyler felt sick. His hands trembled. As he sat down, his mind racing with the thought of what he had just done. He couldn't undo the violence. He couldn't take back the hurt he had caused. The consequences of his actions were now tied to the reputation of a man whose name would forever be associated with justice, while Tyler's would be linked to the opposite violence and brutality. But it wasn't just about John Harris. It was about Tyler's own career, his future, his reputation. Tyler had no idea the extent to which this moment would follow him. He had no clue how deeply his actions would affect everything he had worked for. It was clear now he had made a colossal mistake. His mind raced through the possible outcomes. Would he be fired? Would the department stand by him? Would the community rally behind John Harris and demand justice? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. His father's lessons about power and control had failed him at the most critical moment of his career. In the days that followed, Tyler began to feel the ripple effects of his mistake. The media caught wind of the story, and the more they dug into John Harris's past, the more it became clear just how much Tyler had damaged. The story was everywhere. The video that had been recorded was now circulating widely, and the footage of John's assault became a symbol of everything wrong with the police force. The calls for justice grew louder, and they weren't just coming from the community. Tyler's colleagues were beginning to question his actions too. Even those who had once supported him now looked at him with doubt. And it wasn't just his job on the line anymore. Tyler's personal reputation, his very identity as an officer, was now at risk. The public had already decided what they thought of him. A young cop who was quick to use force, a man who couldn't control his temper, a man who had taken out his frustrations on someone who deserved respect, not violence. This wasn't the first time in history that an officer had used excessive force, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But for Tyler, this was a defining moment. The actions of a single day, the rush of power, the anger, the feeling of control had the potential to destroy everything he had built up. He was a product of his upbringing, of a system that rewarded aggression rather than understanding. Tyler had never learned the true meaning of justice, and now the cost was more than he could have imagined. When we think about Tyler's situation, it's impossible not to draw parallels with other cases throughout history. Darren Wilson, the officer who shot and killed Michael Brown in 2014, for example. Much like Tyler Wilson, was a young officer who felt the weight of his power in moments of tension. But just as Tyler misused his authority, Wilson did the same, and the consequences were devastating not only for Brown but for Wilson as well. While the specific circumstances were different, the underlying issue was the same: a failure to understand the power dynamics at play, a failure to see the humanity of the person on the receiving end of that power. For Tyler, the damage was already done. He had crossed a line that couldn't easily be uncrossed. The question now wasn't whether or not he could repair the damage. It was whether or not he could learn from his mistake, whether he could grow from it. Could he come to terms with what he had done and work to change himself? Or was this the point of no return? As the days passed, Tyler couldn't escape the truth. He had struck a man who had spent his life fighting for justice, for equality, for a better world. And in doing so, he had revealed his own ignorance, his own inability to see beyond the badge he wore. Tyler Grant had learned the hard way that power doesn't make you right, and that no amount of force can fix the mistakes of the past. For him, the road ahead would be long. But for John Harris, the battle for justice had only just begun. As the news about Tyler Grant's actions spread through the police department, it didn't take long for the division to start taking shape. Officers who had once considered him one of their own began to split into two distinct camps. Some stood behind him, justifying his actions, while others were left questioning his choices, his ethics, and whether he truly understood the responsibilities that came with his badge. It didn't take long for the first round of conversations to begin. The patrol room, which had once been a place of casual camaraderie and teamwork, now buzzed with tension. Some officers gathered together, nodding in agreement as they discussed Tyler's behavior. They spoke in hushed tones, rationalizing his actions, convincing themselves that what he did wasn't necessarily wrong. He was just doing his job. One officer argued, "Sometimes people don't listen. You got to be firm with them." But not everyone agreed. There were others who shook their heads in disbelief, who felt a deep sense of unease when they heard about Tyler's actions. Detective Laura Hayes, a seasoned officer who had been with the department for nearly 20 years, couldn't keep her feelings hidden. "This is not what we're here for," she said sharply, her voice rising above the quiet chatter. "We're supposed to serve and protect, not act like bullies. That's not what being a cop is about." As the debate spread, so did the sense of unease within the department. Tyler's actions were raising uncomfortable questions that no one was willing to ignore. How far could a police officer go in the name of doing their job? Was it acceptable to use physical force in situations where it was clearly not needed? And perhaps most importantly, could someone like Tyler, who was clearly struggling with his own understanding of power, continue to serve the community with the level of integrity the badge required? For Tyler, the division was deeply unsettling. He had always seen his colleagues as a unit, a group of people who worked together, had each other's backs, and followed the same code. But now cracks were forming. It wasn't just the outward tension that bothered him. It was the realization that his actions had forced his colleagues to take sides. Some defended him blindly, others doubted him, and a few outright questioned whether he should even remain on the force. The support that Tyler received from a small group of colleagues did little to ease the discomfort he was feeling. In fact, it only heightened the division within the department. Some officers truly believed that his actions, while harsh, were justified by the situation. They saw it as a matter of maintaining control and not letting people get away with disrespect. Tyler had simply been doing what they thought any officer in his position should have done, asserted authority. But even those who defended him couldn't ignore the growing unease that was spreading among others in the force. As time went on, it became clear that Tyler's behavior had shaken the very foundation of what it meant to be a police officer, not just to the public, but within the department itself. The question lingered in the air like a cloud. How far did the right to enforce the law extend, and at what cost? Sergeant Mark Davis, a respected officer with decades of experience, had been watching the situation unfold from a distance. He had seen the tension build among his colleagues, and he knew something had to give. He called for a meeting in the break room, hoping to address the situation head-on. As the officers filtered in, the room grew quiet, all eyes on Sergeant Davis. "Listen," he began, his tone firm but measured. "We all signed up for this job to protect and serve. That means we have a responsibility to the community and to each other. We're not above the law. We have a duty to uphold the values of fairness, justice, and respect." What happened with Tyler is an issue that goes beyond just one officer. It goes to the heart of what it means to wear this badge. As Sergeant Davis spoke, he looked around the room, watching his colleagues closely. The message he was sending wasn't just for Tyler. It was for all of them. There was a deep silence in the room as the officers processed his words. Some nodded, understanding the gravity of the conversation. Others, still loyal to Tyler, exchanged uneasy glances. The division within the department was more evident than ever. Char. What was unfolding within the department was not just a simple disagreement over one officer's actions. It was a reflection of the larger issues within policing in America. The tension that Tyler's situation had brought to the surface was a mirror to the debates happening in communities across the country. How far should police officers be allowed to go in the name of enforcement? What happens when power is wielded without accountability? And perhaps most importantly, where does the line between justice and abuse of power truly lie? As the weeks passed, the internal debate grew more intense. Officers who had once worked side by side now found themselves questioning each other's values, questioning what it truly meant to protect and serve. For Tyler, this divide was a wake-up call. He had spent so much time focused on power, on maintaining control, that he had failed to understand the very thing that made a police officer worthy of respect: the ability to wield that power with empathy, with responsibility, and with the awareness that the badge was not just a symbol of authority, but of trust. The truth was, Tyler had failed to understand the deeper moral responsibilities of his role. And as the debate within the department continued, he found himself torn between the loyalty of those who believed he was simply doing his job and the overwhelming sense of discomfort from those who saw his actions for what they truly were: a dangerous misuse of power. In the end, the question that plagued Tyler's department was not just about whether his actions were right or wrong, but whether the police force could continue to operate under a system where authority could be so easily abused. Could they continue to pretend that the line between justice and violence wasn't blurry? Could they go on pretending that the rules they followed, rules that were supposed to keep the community safe, were truly being enforced with integrity? For Tyler, the growing division within the department became more than just a personal issue. It was a reflection of the system that had failed him and the people he was supposed to protect. And as he sat in silence watching his colleagues argue, he knew that something had to change. Because if it didn't, the rift in the department would only continue to widen, and the consequences for everyone involved would be far-reaching. The tension was palpable. This was no longer just about one man's mistake. It was about the future of the department, about the future of law enforcement, and about the power that came with the badge. Tyler Grant had unknowingly sparked a conversation that would not be easily silenced. After it didn't take long for the video to spread. What began as a simple recording of an ordinary man being attacked quickly became a viral sensation. The footage, shaky at first, showing Tyler Grant as he struck John Harris, soon flooded social media platforms. It wasn't long before the clip reached thousands, then millions of eyes. Within hours, hashtags began to trend. Justice for John Harris, #police brutality, and #end the abuse began to fill timelines everywhere. The video was a stark, undeniable truth. There was no room for debate. The brutality was clear, and the consequences were immediate. Across the world, people watched in shock and anger. The video, raw and unfiltered, had caught the full ugliness of the moment: Tyler's rage, John's helplessness in the silent crowd. It wasn't just a clip of an assault, it was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in the justice system, a visual cry for accountability. Soon the anger that had been stirred was too great to ignore. News outlets began picking up the story, dissecting the incident frame by frame. What started as a small, almost forgotten moment on a street corner had quickly snowballed into a full-fledged social movement. People took to the streets, to their phones, and to their computers to express their outrage. On social media, the pressure mounted. Everyone had something to say, and everyone felt the need to voice their anger. Comments flooded in, each one more impassioned than the last. "This isn't what the badge stands for," one comment read. "This is what happens when we give unchecked power to people who don't understand justice," said another. But it wasn't just the general public that was speaking out. The people who had once stood silent, those who had witnessed John Harris's attack without intervening, now found their voices. They began to publicly denounce what had happened, acknowledging their own complicity by not stepping in. Social media had given them the space to finally speak out, to show that they recognized the wrongness of the situation. Then, in the span of just a few days, the story became more than just a viral video. It became a global call for justice. Tyler Grant was no longer just an officer in a small town. He was the embodiment of systemic issues in policing. John Harris, a once hidden figure who had quietly given so much to his community, was now a symbol of the countless other victims of police brutality. The outrage was massive, but what truly set this moment apart was the power of social media. Platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook became the arenas where the public could express their dismay, organize protests, and demand change. In a world where news is shared instantly, where videos are spread at lightning speed, social media had become a battleground for justice. Hashtags like #Black Lives Matter, which had previously been used in protests across the country, took on new life. This wasn't just another hashtag, it was a continuation of a movement that had been fighting against the same type of abuse for years. It was a call for change, for the end of police violence, for a demand that justice be served, and it was impossible to ignore. The conversation quickly shifted from Tyler's actions to the larger, more systemic issues that were at play. How could a police officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, act with such blatant disregard for human life? How had the system allowed this to happen again and again? What did this say about the relationship between the police and the communities they served? This wasn't just an isolated incident. The video was a glaring reflection of the decades of tension, of the many cases where police had used excessive force with little to no accountability. The people who had seen the video couldn't ignore what was happening right in front of them. They couldn't unsee the truth. Tyler Grant's name was being plastered everywhere. The department could no longer protect him, not from the public, not from the pressure mounting on social media. The video had made him the face of everything that was wrong with law enforcement. As the online protests grew louder, it was clear that there was a demand for accountability that could not be ignored. Social media had become the catalyst for public change. Where once the voices of the marginalized had been drowned out by systems of power, the internet had amplified their cry. It was a powerful reminder that in the modern world, the people could be heard. The events of the past were now being brought into the light, and people across the globe were ready to do something about it. In the days that followed, it became clear that Tyler was facing more than just legal consequences. The public shaming, the outcry from every corner of the world, made his position untenable. As the calls for his termination grew louder, the police department was forced to respond. The pressure from social media was unlike anything they had ever seen. The video, which had once seemed like a fleeting piece of content, was now the fulcrum on which the weight of the entire situation was balanced. What this moment showed more than anything was the immense power of social media. The ability for people to unite to demand justice, to amplify their voices in real time, it was a game changer. In the past, these kinds of injustices might have stayed hidden, buried under layers of bureaucracy, or lost in a sea of silence. But today, everyone with a smartphone could capture the truth and share it with the world, and the world would respond. For Tyler Grant, the video wasn't just an exposure of his actions, it was a wake-up call to the reality of modern policing. For the community, for the public, for the activists, it was a moment to say enough is enough. And the internet once again had proven its power to stir the masses and shift the tides of justice. In the end, social media did more than just spread the video, it turned it into a movement. It became a rallying cry for those demanding accountability, for those who refused to allow this moment to slip away into the past. Tyler Grant and John Harris were now part of something much larger than themselves. This was no longer about one officer's mistake. It was about a society coming to terms with its own failures and demanding that things change. And as the story continued to unfold, the real work was just beginning. The video had ignited the fire. Now it was up to the people to keep it burning until justice was served. The weight of the situation was undeniable. Tyler Grant's actions, once just a local incident, had become a flashpoint for national discussion. The viral video had ignited protests, sparked public outrage, and forced the police department into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The community had spoken, and the pressure was building on the authorities to take action. The city leaders could no longer remain silent. The mayor, under mounting pressure from the public, announced that an official investigation would be launched. The message was clear: the city would not tolerate any form of police brutality, no matter the circumstances. But the question was, would the investigation be thorough? Would it be impartial, or would it simply be a way to quiet the masses to maintain the status quo? The first meeting between the mayor's office and the police department was tense. The room, once a place for collaboration and discussions of city matters, now felt like a battlefield. Chief Rebecca Thompson, the head of the police force, sat at the table surrounded by her team of officers. She had always been seen as a competent leader, but today she was facing an unprecedented challenge. Mayor Richard Dawson wasted no time getting to the point. His voice was stern, filled with frustration. "We have a problem on our hands," he said, glancing at the video that had been plastered across every screen in the city. "This is not just about an isolated incident. This is about our credibility, our relationship with the community, and the trust that has been broken." Across the table, Chief Thompson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She knew the pressure was on, but she also knew that the officers under her command were deeply divided over what had happened. Some were defending Tyler Grant, while others were demanding accountability. She had to walk a fine line between supporting her officers and ensuring that justice was served. "We will conduct a full investigation, Chief," Thompson said, her voice steady but clearly shaken. "We'll examine every aspect of the incident. Every action will be scrutinized." The meeting continued with more tense discussions about how to handle the public's demand for transparency. But as the hours wore on, the cracks within the department became more apparent. Some officers voiced their concerns about the investigation, questioning whether it would be fair to Tyler. Others, particularly those who had been advocating for stronger action against police brutality, were frustrated with the lack of urgency. "We can't afford to sweep this under the rug," one officer said. "If we do, it'll only make things worse. The community is watching us, and if we don't handle this right, it will be the end of our credibility." But there were also voices on the other side, voices that echoed the sentiment Tyler had felt when he was first confronted about his actions. "We're being unfairly attacked here," one officer said. "He was just doing his job. Sometimes we have to use force. That's the reality of the job. Why is everyone jumping to conclusions without hearing the full story?" The split within the department was becoming impossible to ignore. The tension between officers who wanted to protect Tyler and those who felt the need for accountability was now at the forefront. The city leaders could feel the divide, and they knew that the outcome of the investigation could either heal or deepen the rift. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the meeting room, the pressure from the public was mounting around them. The streets were filled with protesters calling for justice for John Harris. Social media continued to amplify their voices. People weren't just asking for Tyler Grant to be held accountable. They were demanding systemic change. They were demanding that the police force be held to a higher standard, that there be real consequences for officers who used excessive force. The public was watching, and so were the media. Every move the city made was being dissected. Every statement from the police department was scrutinized. The eyes of the world were on them, and the fear of a botched investigation loomed large. For Mayor Dawson, the stakes were higher than ever. He knew that whatever decision he made would have long-lasting consequences for the city. The pressure from the public was fierce, but the internal pressure from the police force was just as intense. How could he maintain peace within his department while ensuring that justice was done? As the meeting concluded, Chief Thompson left with a heavy heart. She knew the department was at a crossroads. The city's relationship with the police was fragile, and Tyler's actions had only highlighted the cracks in the foundation. What would happen if the investigation didn't lead to concrete action? What would happen if the community felt like nothing had changed? The investigation dragged on, but the public's impatience was palpable. The days turned into weeks, and still there was no clear resolution. Protesters in the streets grew more vocal, and the pressure on the city officials intensified. Was this a case of a rogue officer, or was this a symptom of a much larger problem? The question loomed over the investigation like a dark cloud. The comparison to past events was unavoidable. The incident with Tyler Grant reminded many of the case of Eric Garner, who died in 2014 after being placed in a chokehold by an officer. The protests that followed Garner's death were a turning point in the conversation about police brutality in America. People demanded justice, but what followed was a sense of frustration, a feeling that nothing truly changed. The subsequent grand jury decision not to indict the officer involved led to nationwide protests, and the #BlackLivesMatter became a rallying cry for a movement that had been simmering for years. Just like the case of Eric Garner, this incident had sparked a nationwide conversation about the role of the police in society. And once again, the question was raised, how could a system that was supposed to protect people continue to abuse its power? As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that the city was facing a reckoning. The questions surrounding Tyler Grant's actions were just the tip of the iceberg. This was a larger issue, one that couldn't be solved with a simple investigation or a few statements from city officials. The call for reform was loud and clear. The public wanted transparency, they wanted accountability, and most importantly, they wanted real change. In the end, the investigation into Tyler Grant's actions would be remembered not just for what it revealed about one officer's conduct, but for what it exposed about the entire system. A system that had been allowed to operate with a lack of transparency, with a culture that sometimes prioritized loyalty over justice. The lessons from this investigation would shape the future of law enforcement, and the public would be watching every step of the way. In the days following the brutal attack on John Harris, the anger that had been simmering within the community finally erupted. The viral videos seen by millions had sparked something far bigger than just a local incident. It had ignited a nationwide call for justice. People from all walks of life, from the city streets to the corners of the country, were demanding one thing: accountability. The hashtag Justice for John Harris quickly gained momentum, and what began as online outrage quickly spilled into the streets. Protests broke out across the city. Thousands gathered in front of City Hall, their voices rising in unison. John Harris's name was now on the lips of every protester, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the system. Signs reading "Justice for John" and "End Police Brutality" waved in the air, carried by individuals who were tired, frustrated, and finally ready to demand change. The streets, once quiet and calm, were now filled with people chanting, demanding that Tyler Grant and all officers involved be held accountable for their actions. The atmosphere was charged. There was an undeniable tension in the air, a sense that the moment had arrived. The protesters were no longer simply asking for justice, they were demanding it, and they weren't backing down. The police presence was heavy, the line between protesters and law enforcement becoming more pronounced as the day wore on. Officers standing in riot gear formed barricades to contain the crowds, their faces hidden behind shields and helmets. The protesters, however, were undeterred, their voices growing louder with each passing hour. They knew that they had the power to make a change, but it wasn't just the city streets that were alive with tension. Online, the protests continued to grow. Videos, photos, and stories were shared at an overwhelming pace. The world was watching. And as the global community tuned in, the pressure on the local government and police force became unbearable. The demand for Tyler Grant's resignation grew stronger by the minute. People were calling for transparency, for a full investigation, for justice to be served. The public outcry was met with resistance from the local government. Mayor Dawson, who had initially promised a thorough investigation, now found himself in a difficult position. The protests were growing louder and the pressure was mounting. The community, once willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, was now demanding immediate action. The mayor's office was filled with tense conversations as officials debated how to respond to the increasingly vocal protests. Some wanted to take a firm stance, issuing statements in support of the protesters. Others, however, were more cautious, warning that the protests could be a threat to public order. As the days went by, it became clear that the protests weren't going to subside. The people had spoken and they weren't backing down. Tyler Grant's actions had become a symbol of the larger issue of police brutality, and the community wasn't willing to let the conversation die down. The protesters were fighting not just for John Harris, but for every person who had been unjustly treated by those in power. The demand for change wasn't just a reaction to this specific incident, it was a call for systemic reform. The protests began to grow in size, spreading across the city, with people from all walks of life joining in. Young and old students and teachers, mothers and fathers, all were united by one simple message: enough is enough. The chants grew louder and the signs grew bolder. Tyler Grant's name, once a simple officer in a small town, was now synonymous with everything wrong in the justice system. He had become the face of the problem that had plagued American society for far too long. For the protesters, this wasn't just about Tyler Grant. This was about a system that had repeatedly failed the community, about a history of police brutality that had gone unchecked for decades. It was about John Harris, a man who had given so much to his community, only to be treated like a stranger on his own streets. It was about the realization that if nothing changed, this same story would continue to be told again and again with no end in sight. As the protests continued, a sense of solidarity began to build. The protesters knew they were part of something much bigger than just their city. They were part of a movement that stretched across the country, a movement that had been growing for years. Black Lives Matter, a movement that had already seen countless marches, rallies, and protests, was now united with the cause for John Harris. The fight for justice was no longer just local, it was national, and it was gaining momentum. The comparison to historical moments like the Selma March was undeniable. In 1965, thousands marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama, demanding the right to vote and an end to racial injustice. The marchers faced violence, but they stood firm. They knew their actions would be the spark that ignited a movement that would change the course of history. Today, the protesters for John Harris were doing the same thing. They were standing up for what was right, even in the face of resistance, even when the odds were stacked against them. As the protests continued to grow, so did the pressure on Tyler Grant and the police department. It wasn't just about a video anymore. It was about the very foundation of the police force's relationship with the community. The people were no longer willing to accept the status quo. They were demanding accountability, transparency, and justice. The city was being forced to confront its past, its policies, and its systems, and the people weren't going to stop until they had answers. The protests weren't just a fight for John Harris anymore. They were a fight for every person who had been wronged by those in power, every person who had been silenced by a system that was supposed to protect them. The message was clear: Tyler Grant was a symbol of a much larger problem, one that could no longer be ignored. As the days turned into weeks, the protests didn't show signs of slowing down. The momentum was building, and with it a sense of urgency. The community had found its voice, and it wasn't going to be silenced. Tyler Grant would soon have to face the consequences of his actions, not just in the courts, but in the streets where the people were demanding justice. The question now wasn't whether or not justice would be served, it was how long it would take for the system to catch up with the voices of the people. Would the public's demand for accountability be enough to spark real change, or would this be just another moment of outrage that would fade away? One thing was clear, the fight for justice had only just begun.
Xiaom.
The world had been watching. The protests, the hashtags, the viral video, it all led to this moment. Tyler Grant had lived through the whirlwind of public outrage, and now he was standing on the edge of everything he had built. His career, his reputation, and his life as a police officer were hanging by a thread. The very people who had once seen him as a colleague, a protector of the law, were now looking at him with disdain. They weren't just questioning his actions, they were demanding that he pay the price for what he had done. It was a cold morning when Tyler was summoned to the city hall. The room was filled with people with faces that had once been familiar to him, now filled with judgment. Mayor Dawson stood at the front, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. The entire city had come to this point, and the question was no longer about the details of the incident. It was about accountability, about what was just and what was right. Tyler walked into the room, his steps heavy, his thoughts racing. He had seen the protests, the calls for his resignation, the videos of John Harris's assault replaying over and over on social media. The community had spoken, and now they were looking to him for an answer. Tyler was no longer just an officer, he was a symbol of the broken system that had allowed things like this to happen time and time again. When he stood before the crowd, it wasn't just the mayor and the officials in the room who were watching. It was the people, the very same people who had once trusted him to protect them, to serve them. The faces of the protesters, the faces of the community, all staring at him with silent fury. Tyler could feel the weight of their eyes. He could feel the years of hope, of trust, all shattering in that single moment. His actions had not only hurt John Harris, but they had hurt the very people he had sworn to protect. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had failed them. He had failed the community he was supposed to serve. The room grew silent as Tyler was asked to speak. The pressure, the eyes upon him, the weight of his mistakes, all of it came crashing down. He wasn't prepared for this. He had always thought he was in control, that he could handle any situation, but now he realized how little control he truly had. He had been given a badge, a position of power, and he had abused it. Now the very people he had tried to control were demanding his accountability. I made a mistake, Tyler began, his voice trembling slightly, but he couldn't take back the words, the actions. I failed the people I was supposed to protect. He paused, the silence around him pressing in. I let my anger and my power blind me to what's right. And for that, I am sorry. The room didn't respond right away. There was no applause, no sign of forgiveness. The damage had already been done. Tyler had crossed a line that couldn't easily be erased. His apology, though heartfelt, felt like a drop in an ocean of pain. The community wasn't looking for words, they were looking for action. They were looking for a change, for accountability, and for a future where they could trust those who were sworn to protect them. In the days that followed, Tyler's fate was sealed. The investigation into the incident had concluded, and the verdict was clear. Tyler Grant would be terminated from the police force. His actions, his disregard for justice, his failure to uphold the law, all had consequences. Tyler had been held accountable, but it didn't undo the harm he had caused. It didn't restore the trust he had shattered. But the story didn't end with his downfall. The real story was about the community, about the people who had stood up and demanded justice. The protests, the calls for accountability had brought about a change. Tyler's fall from grace was the consequence of a system that had allowed injustice to thrive for too long. And the community had spoken louder than ever before. Enough was enough. They were no longer willing to let the system protect those who abused their power. They were demanding transparency, demanding reform, and demanding justice. As Tyler Grant walked away from the podium, the weight of his actions still hung heavy on his shoulders. But in the distance, he could see the protesters outside still chanting, still demanding. John Harris's name echoed in the air, not as a symbol of victimhood, but as a symbol of resilience. The battle for justice wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The lesson here is clear. Justice requires more than just words. It requires action. It requires accountability. Tyler had learned that the hard way. He had been given a powerful tool, the badge, but he had failed to understand the responsibility that came with it. Now, as the community looked toward the future, the question was no longer about what had happened, it was about what would happen next. Would the system change? Would the police force change? Would they learn from this and do better? The story of Tyler Grant and John Harris was a painful reminder of the flaws in the system, but it was also a powerful example of the importance of standing up, of demanding accountability, of ensuring that justice is served. The future, while uncertain, was in the hands of the community. It was up to them to ensure that the lessons learned would not be forgotten. And it was up to everyone, not just the authorities, to make sure that justice, transparency, and fairness became the foundation of the future. In the end, Tyler Grant had paid a price for his mistakes, but the community had gained something far more valuable, the belief that their voices could make a difference, and that in the long run was the greatest victory of all. As Tyler Grant walks away, his career shattered and his future uncertain. One thing is painfully clear. Sometimes the price of justice is far greater than anyone could ever expect. But here's the real shocker. What if the real lesson isn't just about one officer's downfall, but about the power we all have to change the system? The truth is, we are all responsible for the world we live in, and if we stay silent, the cycle of injustice will never end. So if you believe that change is possible, if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that subscribe button, because the fight for justice is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Stay tuned. The battle isn't over.